The room was silent, the light of the moon reflecting off the window and illuminating the room in a silvery glow. The man lay on his back, his eyes closed. It had been over 2 hours since he last awoke. He heard the door click and the creak of the old floorboard as someone walked into the room. They must have been worried about him. They sat down next to him, resting their hand on his shoulder. He rolled over onto his side so he was facing them. When he opened his eyes, all he saw was an outline, but it didn't matter anymore because he knew whose it was. Bruno. A gentle smile played across her face at the sound of his voice. She moved slightly closer to him before leaning forward, pressing her lips to his forehead. Her touch sent shivers down his spine. "You're up," she whispered after pulling away from the kiss. She stroked his hair away from his face. His eyes drifted shut. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," he replied, smiling when a small chuckle escaped her mouth. "What happened tonight? You were gone for almost 20 minutes before I got here." He sighed and turned over onto his stomach, facing his back towards her. This action caused her head to follow his lead. "It's nothing really, just the usual thing that goes on when we run through hell on earth like we do every day." Bruno chuckled again and shook his head. "But I think they know we're here now. At least, I hope so." He felt her hand rest gently on his waist. It wasn't an unusual feeling, in fact, it was something that he quite liked. He turned and met her gaze once more, though this time it was softer than before. She leaned in and pressed another chaste kiss to his lips. They stayed like that for what felt like forever, wrapped in each other's arms. Eventually, they both decided that enough time had passed. Slowly and carefully, they untangled their limbs from each other. As soon as he was on the ground, Bruno stood up and stretched before turning around and taking a few steps in the direction he came from. He stopped when he was halfway there and turned back to look at her. She watched as he took in his surroundings, his brow furrowed slightly and a concerned expression written on his face. Bruno turned to fully face her and took a tentative step toward her. With no hesitation at all, she placed one of her hands gently against his cheek and pulled him down to meet her for a deep, tender kiss. As they separated, she rested her forehead against his and breathed deeply. He brought his right hand up and caressed her cheek with his thumb. "We'll figure this out, okay?" He spoke softly in a whisper, not wanting to disturb any of the others still sleeping in the house nearby. "I love you so much, Bruno Buccolati." Her voice echoed in his brain for days afterwards. He couldn't help but think how perfect their lives had become since she'd come into his life. He could hardly believe that things would ever go wrong, especially after having such a wonderful beginning. They never thought of themselves as special or extraordinary. All they wanted was peace and quiet, and that was exactly what was waiting for them in their house, a place where they belonged, surrounded by people who loved them and understood who they were. They were happy. As if in answer to his question, they heard another set of footsteps walk past them. Bruno glanced over to see who it was, but his gaze fell short. "Hey Bruno." A soft voice called his name and he looked up at the woman walking towards him. He smiled slightly. It had been 3 months since she had entered his life, but she already had a permanent place in it. It wasn't fair. Why couldn't everyone be as strong and selfless as she was? He watched as he approached until his body blocked his view. "Hi Gio," Bruno said, unable to keep himself from smiling as he remembered the first time Gio told him to call him by his first name. It was silly to call everyone else by their last names and even stupider to think that Bruno did. But Gio had always made it feel normal, like Bruno didn't have to worry about what anyone might think of him. And he loved every minute of it. "How are you?" Gio asked, looking back at him with concern etched into his beautiful face. Bruno shrugged. "Better than yesterday." Gio gave a sympathetic smile and reached out to put a comforting arm on his shoulders. "Did your dad take care of you?" Bruno nodded. "He kept telling me to stay indoors because my fever was high, but he was pretty much useless anyway." "Still, it can get a little lonely without your family sometimes," Gio remarked. He removed his arm from his shoulder. "Yeah," Bruno responded. After a pause, Bruno broke the silence. "Thanks for coming today," he said with gratitude. Gio smiled warmly. "No problem," he said. "And for what it's worth, I am sorry. I wish I hadn't taken that bullet for you. I was stupid and reckless and—" "Gio, I've told you before," Bruno interrupted. "This is my job. I can take care of myself. Besides, you saved me. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't still be here." He paused, his gaze falling to the ground. "I don't deserve any of her kindness. Especially not after what happened," he trailed off as a lump grew in his throat. Gio stepped closer and grabbed his chin, forcing him to look at him. "None of that matters now," he said, holding Bruno's gaze firmly. I'm just glad you're okay. He released Bruno's chin and let his hands fall to his sides. He shifted awkwardly, avoiding eye contact as he spoke. So what have you been doing lately? I mean besides being sick. Bruno laughed. Oh, you should hear some of what we've done in the last week. We found out that there's a zombie apocalypse going on, you know, the ones that eat humans. Well, guess what? We managed to stop them. And I killed a vampire with one hit. And we also found out about this new power we all have, but recalling it the power of friendship. It works like this: when I hurt somebody, I feel a sort of pain on the inside of my chest and I can tell that I need to apologize. So I usually go find some friends and talk with them for a couple days until the pain goes away. Gio smiled. He was happy that Bruno was finally getting better. He could only imagine how difficult things must have been for him. That sounds like fun, he commented. Do you have any idea what I went through in that mansion? Exclamation mark. I lost my whole family and there was nothing I could do. Bruno exclaimed, his tone laced with frustration. And then these people show up. I didn't even know that they existed. Do you know what it feels like living somewhere where you have no one to turn to but people like us and yet they treat us like dirt? I just want my family back. I want everything to go back to the way it used to be. Don't worry, Bruno. Your family is gonna come home someday and everything will be okay. No matter what. Thank you, Gio, Bruno muttered quietly. He turned his attention towards the night sky and sighed. I love our house. It's perfect. Our house. Gio said slowly, wondering why it sounded familiar. Yes, our house. It has 4 bedrooms. There's 2 bathrooms, one with a bath and one where we share one. The basement has a wine cellar. And it has its own garden too. I can't thank you enough for helping me find that money in Paris. That was crazy luck. It took us ages to find those bank records, Bruno exclaimed happily. Oh yeah, Gio said. He rubbed his neck nervously. Well, it was nothing. You did so much for me, Gio. I can never repay you enough for all of that, he added. There is nothing you need to repay me for. Gio's eyes flickered with confusion and surprise. There isn't. No, not anything, he responded. Then what is there? He questioned. Nothing, he said quickly. Just forget about it. Bruno frowned at Gio. His heart started beating erratically when Gio turned his back to him. How many times was he going to hear these same words? Whenever he talked about it, Gio always insisted that he didn't want anything from him. Was this a trick of Gio's to try and convince him that there was something between them that they couldn't have? What other explanation could there possibly be? Bruno knew that Gio had feelings for him, but he couldn't bring himself to admit it. He was afraid that it might break their fragile relationship if he confessed. He was scared of breaking their trust in each other. But he was also curious. Even more so after talking with Renato earlier. He could almost feel him shaking his head at him. You should give him the chance to reciprocate your feelings, dummy. And besides, he won't leave you behind. Not again. But still, there was something gnawing at his insides whenever they hung out like this. Something he couldn't quite explain. Maybe he was simply waiting for the day where Gio would finally say something about it. That was why he was hesitant to say anything now. He knew that if he was to start pushing and prodding for an answer, Gio would probably refuse. After all, they had been dating for less than half a year. There were still so many gaps between him and Gio that he didn't know anything about. He didn't want to mess things up by forcing Gio into telling him what was really bothering him. Bruno sighed and turned to watch as Gio walked back to the kitchen table that sat near the window. It didn't escape his notice that Gio's steps seemed slower than usual. He followed him and leaned against the doorframe as he tried to decide if he should ask him what was wrong or wait for him to open up on his own. What is it? Bruno whispered quietly, hoping not to draw too much attention to themselves. Nothing, Gio replied shortly. He turned around. Is there anything you want? A snack maybe. Bruno shook his head and gave him an apologetic look. No thanks. I don't wanna bother you. That's fine, really. There's plenty left, you know. Actually, Gio, Bruno began hesitantly. Before you say anything else, would you mind telling me something? Of course, Bruno, Gio answered, his eyes shining brightly with curiosity. What is it? Well, I saw your mother the other day outside. She told me that she's sorry about what happened, Bruno continued. He waited anxiously while Gio stared at him. Finally, when he didn't respond, Bruno continued. She said that you came and helped her that day. When you were in the hospital. Is that true? He questioned cautiously. Slowly, Gio nodded. Yes. But don't let me get you wrong, Bruno. It wasn't my fault. It was her choice. Bruno swallowed thickly. The guilt was eating away at him like poison. Why did you leave? Gio looked away and sighed softly as he thought about his answer. He didn't want to lie to him. It was too painful to tell him the truth, though. It's complicated, Bruno, he murmured, rubbing the bridge of his nose. My life was different when I first met her. I felt like I was free, like I had no responsibilities and no problems. Everything had changed, however, when we were together. Before then, I didn't know how to live with her, but she made everything easier than ever. I think she's my destiny, and I didn't want to lose her. I wanted to keep her, even when I knew it was too late because she was already gone. He closed his eyes briefly. Anyway, she was my past. Now she's all that's left of my past and everything that was once mine. My future, however, doesn't seem to involve her anymore, he said bitterly. Bruno nodded slightly. How about you? Gio continued. Have you thought about anyone that may affect your recovery? Like if someone gets hurt, I mean. Bruno shrugged in response. Yeah, actually. There was this lady that got stabbed in the foot when she was walking her dog. The guy who caused the accident drove past her without looking, but she ended up getting stuck behind him and getting stabbed in the heel. If anything happens to them, I'll probably end up having to take care of the dog. Gio watched Bruno carefully as he continued speaking. And then there was the time where some kid got mugged in front of my house. I tried my hardest to help him, but it wasn't enough, and I ended up leaving town after that because I couldn't handle the guilt, he said. And sometimes, when I get bored, I wander through some of the old buildings to see if I can find anything useful to steal. Or to take pictures of things that look interesting. Or to write down stories about them. Sounds kinda dangerous, Gio stated worriedly. Do you get hurt very often? All the time. But it's fine. I can take care of myself, he said dismissively. He paused for a moment and glanced down at the floor before continuing. In fact, I think it's time for a change. I don't wanna stay here with all these weirdos. This place gives me the creeps. But we're happy here. We're doing well, aren't we, Gio? We are, Bruno, he replied firmly. So why don't you wanna stay? What's really bothering you? You've been acting strangely since we arrived and you refused to tell me anything. Why? For a few seconds, Gio hesitated. Then he sighed loudly and closed his eyes. Fine. Just stop asking questions.